The autumn wind howled through the cracks in the barn walls like a wounded animal, carrying with it the scent of approaching winter and the promise of harder days ahead. Silas Boone stood at the edge of his property, watching the storm clouds gather over the Wyoming horizon, their dark bellies heavy with rain. At 43, he had grown accustomed to the solitude that wrapped around him like a well-worn coat, comfortable, familiar, and utterly empty. The ranch sprawled before him, 2,000 acres of grass and sagebrush that he'd built with his own hands over the past 15 years. The main house sat sturdy against the elements, its log walls darkened by weather and time. Beyond it, the barn loomed like a faithful sentinel, sheltering his horses from the harsh realities of frontier life. Everything here bore the mark of his labor, yet none of it held the warmth of a true home. Thunder rolled across the valley as the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Silas pulled his hat lower and made his way back to the house, his boots leaving deep impressions in the dusty ground that would soon turn to mud. Inside, he lit the oil lamp and settled into his chair by the window, watching as the storm unleashed its fury upon the land. The rain came in sheets now, driven horizontal by the wind. Through the window, he could see the barn door swaying slightly, peculiar, as he was certain he'd latched it securely that morning, with a sigh that spoke of bones too tired for their years. He donned his oilskin coat and ventured back into the tempest. The short walk to the barn left him soaked despite his protection. He pushed against the door, which groaned on its hinges as he stepped inside. The familiar smell of hay and horses enveloped him, but something was different. There, in the far corner where he stored the winter feed, a figure lay curled in the straw. His hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip, though he didn't draw it. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering through the cracks in the walls, the figure stirred. A woman, painfully thin, clutched a small child to her chest. Her dress, once fine but now tattered and mud-stained, spoke of better days long past. She jerked awake at his approach, wild fear flashing in her eyes as she scrambled to shield the child. Her hair, dark and matted with rain, obscured her face until she pushed it back with a trembling hand. In that moment, Silas felt the world tilt on its axis. Rosalie? The name escaped his lips as barely more than a whisper. 15 years of wondering compressed into 3 syllables. She froze, recognition dawning slowly across features that had been etched by hardship but remained achingly familiar. The proud jaw, the determined set of her mouth, all still there beneath the marks of suffering. Silas. His name on her lips sounded like a prayer and a curse combined. She tried to stand, swayed, and sank back into the straw. "We need to go. We shouldn't have—" "It's me," he said simply, holding his hands out to show he meant no harm. "Just me." The child, a girl of perhaps 6 or 7, peered out from behind her mother with eyes too old for such a young face. She wore a dress that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible beneath the patches. Silas's mind reeled, trying to reconcile the elegant young woman he'd loved with this desperate creature before him. Rosalie Ashford had been the belle of Cheyenne, daughter of a prosperous merchant, with skin like porcelain and a laugh that could light up a room. They'd been young, he barely 28, she just 19, when they'd fallen into a love so fierce it had consumed them both. He remembered their last meeting with painful clarity, the grove of cottonwoods by the creek where they'd met in secret for months, her tears as she'd promised to stand up to her parents, to choose love over propriety. The next morning, she was gone. No word, no explanation. Her father had simply said she'd gone east to visit relatives and wouldn't be returning. "How long have you been here?" he asked, forcing himself back to the present. "Since yesterday. The door, it wasn't locked proper. I'm sorry. We just needed somewhere dry for the night. We'll leave come morning." "In this storm?" He shook his head. "That child will catch her death," as if to emphasize his point. Thunder crashed overhead, making the little girl whimper and burrow deeper into her mother's arms. "What's her name?" he asked, gentling his voice. Rosalie hesitated before answering. "Clara." Her name is Clara. Well then, Miss Clara, Silas said, crouching down to the child's level. How would you and your mama like some hot soup and a proper bed for the night? The girl looked to her mother, who sat rigid with indecision. Pride, fear, and exhaustion warred across Rosalie's face. Please, he added quietly. Whatever brought you here, whatever you're running from, it can wait until the storm passes. You don't understand, Rosalie whispered. If he finds us, nobody's finding anybody tonight, Silas said firmly. Not in this weather, not on my land. He stood and moved to the barn door, holding it open. The rain still fell in torrents, turning the yard into a muddy lake. When he looked back, Rosalie had struggled to her feet, Clara clinging to her skirts. They made the dash to the house together, Silas carrying Clara while Rosalie stumbled alongside them. Once inside, he stoked the fire and set water to boil while mother and daughter huddled near the hearth, steam rising from their sodden clothes. In the lamplight, he could see Rosalie more clearly. The years had carved lines around her eyes and mouth, and there was a hardness there that spoke of survival rather than living. Her left hand bore a plain gold band, and he noticed how she unconsciously turned it, as if it were a shackle rather than a symbol of love. I have some clothes, he said awkwardly. My sister left them last time she visited. They might fit. While they changed in his bedroom, he prepared what food he had, beans and salt pork, with bread only a day old. When they emerged, Rosalie wearing his sister Mary's practical dress and Clara swimming in one of his old shirts, they looked marginally more human. They ate in silence, Clara wolfing down her portion while Rosalie picked at hers, her eyes never leaving the windows as if expecting shadows to materialize from the storm. We're safe here, Silas said finally. Whatever you're afraid of, it won't come through that door without my say-so. Rosalie's laugh was bitter. You always were too confident for your own good, and you always were too stubborn to accept help when you needed it. Their eyes met across the table, and for a moment, the years fell away. He saw the girl who'd danced with him at the harvest social, who'd kissed him breathless behind her father's store, who'd promised him forever with stars in her eyes. Why? He asked, the question he'd carried for 15 years finally given voice. Why did you leave without a word? She looked away, fingers tightening on her spoon. It wasn't my choice. Whose then? Does it matter now? She gestured to herself, to Clara, to the whole sorry situation. Look what those choices led to. Clara yawned hugely, and Rosalie's expression softened as she smoothed the child's hair. She needs sleep. Take my bed, Silas offered. I'll bunk out here by the fire. We couldn't. You can, and you will. His tone brooked no argument. Whatever else has passed between us, Rosalie, I'm still a gentleman, and no child sleeps in my barn while there's a perfectly good bed sitting empty. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Just for tonight. As he helped them settle in, tucking extra quilts around Clara, who was already drifting off. Rosalie caught his hand. I thought about writing, she whispered. 1,000 times. But what could I say? How could I explain? You could have tried. Some cages don't have keys. Silas, some doors, once closed, don't open again. He wanted to press, to demand the truth that had eluded him all these years. But exhaustion lined her face, and Clara murmured in her sleep, curling closer to her mother. We'll talk tomorrow, he said. Rest now. As he closed the door behind him, he heard Rosalie singing softly, the same lullaby she used to hum when they'd lie beneath the stars, planning a future that never came. He stood there, hand on the doorframe, letting the past wash over him like the rain still pounding against the roof. Whatever had driven her back to him, whatever danger followed in her wake. One thing was certain. Rosalie Ashford, or whatever her name was now, had returned, and this time, he'd be damned if he let her disappear again without answers. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the world washed clean and glistening under a pale sun. Silas had barely slept, spending the night in his chair by the dying fire, memories churning like the clouds that had rolled through. When he heard movement from the bedroom, He set coffee to brewing and sliced what remained of yesterday's bread. Rosalie emerged first, her hair braided simply, Mary's dress hanging loose on her thin frame. In daylight, the toll of her years away showed more starkly, the hollow of her cheeks, the defensive hunch of her shoulders, the way she startled when he moved too suddenly. "Coffee?" he offered, and she nodded gratefully, wrapping her hands around the tin cup as if drawing strength from its warmth. They sat at the kitchen table while Clara still slept, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, as thunder rumbled distantly, promising another storm, Rosalie began to speak. "His name was Theodore Brennan." The words came haltingly, as if she'd forgotten how to tell her own story. "My parents arranged it, said he was a prosperous rancher from Colorado, widowed, needing a wife to help raise his son. They said I'd shame them with our attachment, that no decent man in Cheyenne would have me after I'd been seen sneaking off to meet you." Silas's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her find her rhythm. "The wedding was 3 days after they sent me away. I never even came back to Cheyenne. They were too afraid I'd try to find you." A bitter smile twisted her lips. "They were right. Of course, I would have." She paused to sip her coffee, gathering strength for what came next. "Theodore seemed kind enough at first, attentive, generous even. His ranch was large, the house fine. I thought perhaps I could learn to be content, if not happy. But once we were married," her voice trailed off, and she unconsciously rubbed her left arm. Silas noticed faint scars there, old but unmistakable. "He drank," she continued quietly. "And when he drank, he became someone else, someone who saw enemies everywhere, who thought every smile I gave the shopkeeper was a sign of unfaithfulness, who believed discipline was the answer to any perceived slight." "Rosalie, please let me finish." She met his eyes briefly before looking away. "His son from his first marriage left as soon as he could. Smart boy. I wasn't so lucky. By then, I had Clara, and Theodore made it clear what would happen if I tried to leave. He had friends, the sheriff, the judge, his word against mine. And who would believe a wayward wife?" Thunder rolled closer, and she glanced nervously toward the window. "But last month, he went too far. Clara tried to help me when he was in one of his moods. He struck her." Her hands clenched around the cup. "That was my line. You don't touch my child. So you ran. In the middle of the night, with nothing but the clothes on our backs and what little money I'd hidden away. We've been moving ever since, staying where we could, working when someone would hire a woman with a child and no references." She laughed humorlessly. "Do you know I ended up back in Wyoming by pure chance? I was trying to get to California, but our money ran out in Laramie. Then I heard someone mention your name in the mercantile, said Silas Boone had built himself quite a spread out here. I told myself I was just curious, that I'd pass by and keep going, but then the storm came, and Clara was so cold, and my barn door was conveniently unlatched." A ghost of her old smile appeared. "You always were careless about that door." They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Silas asked, "Does he know where you've gone?" "He's looking," put out word, offering a reward for information about his stolen wife and daughter. "That's what the posters say, that I stole Clara from him." Her voice turned fierce. "As if a mother could steal her own child." Silas rose and moved to the stove, ostensibly to refill their coffee, but really to master the rage building in his chest. The thought of anyone laying hands on Rosalie, on that innocent child sleeping in the next room, made his blood burn. "You'll stay here," he said, his back still to her. "Both of you. Silas, we can't. This isn't charity, if that's what's bothering you." He turned to face her. "I need help around here. Can't keep up with everything myself anymore. You could cook, help with the house. Clara's old enough to gather eggs, tend the garden, room and board in exchange for work. That's a fair arrangement. And when Theodore comes looking, because he will, Silas, He's not a man who accepts defeat. Then he'll find out what kind of man I've become in 15 years. His voice carried a quiet authority that hadn't been there in his youth. This is my land, Rosalie, my rules, and I say you stay. Before she could argue further, Clara appeared in the doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes. Mama? I'm here, sweetheart. Rosalie's entire demeanor softened as she opened her arms to her daughter. Clara climbed into her lap, then peered shyly at Silas. Are we staying here, Mama? Rosalie hesitated, looking between her daughter's hopeful face and Silas's steady gaze. For a little while, perhaps. After breakfast, Silas showed them around the property. Clara's eyes widened at the horses in the paddock, and she laughed, actually laughed, when one of the gentler mares nuzzled her hand looking for treats. She's beautiful, Clara breathed, stroking the mare's nose. Her name's Buttercup, Silas said, and she's partial to little girls who are kind to her. While Clara was distracted with the horses, Rosalie watched Silas work, noting the efficient way he moved. The gentle hands that had grown calloused but not cruel. This was not the impetuous young man she'd known, but someone tempered by solitude and responsibility. You've done well for yourself, she said quietly. Well enough. He checked Buttercup's hooves with practiced ease, though it's a lot of space for one person. The weight of those words hung between them. He straightened, dusting off his hands, and their eyes met over Clara's head. For a moment, she saw a flash of the old Silas, the one who'd promised to wait for her forever, who'd carved their initials in the big cottonwood by the creek. That tree still standing? She asked suddenly. His smile was answer enough. Lightning took half of it 5 years back, but the other half's still there. Still has our mark, too. That evening, while Clara helped set the table with endearing carefulness, Silas found himself watching Rosalie move about his kitchen as if she belonged there. She'd pinned her hair up, revealing the elegant line of her neck, and was humming under her breath, not the sad lullaby from last night, but something lighter. Mama seems happier, Clara confided to him in a whisper that carried clearly across the room. She hasn't smiled this much in forever. The innocent words hit him like a physical blow. What kind of life had they been living that a single day of safety could make such a difference? After dinner, he pulled out a map. Show me, he said to Rosalie. Where's his ranch? She pointed to a spot in Colorado, about a week's ride south. But he has men in most of the towns between here and there, and friends among the lawmen. Not here he doesn't. Silas studied the map thoughtfully. Sheriff Watson's a fair man, and he owes me a favor or two. You can't fight my battles for me, Silas. Watch me. She shook her head but didn't argue further. As the evening deepened, Clara began to yawn, and Rosalie rose to put her to bed. We'll take the barn, she said. Now that it's dry, you'll do no such thing. He gestured toward the back of the house. There's a room off the kitchen, used to be for a hired hand, but I've never needed one. It's small but clean, has its own door to the outside, so you can come and go without feeling beholden. Her eyes glistened suspiciously. Why are you doing this? You know why. The words fell between them like stones in still water, sending ripples through the careful distance they'd maintained all day. Rosalie's hand rose unconsciously to her throat, and he saw her pulse fluttering there like a trapped bird. That was a long time ago, she whispered. Not so long that I've forgotten. Clara called for her mother, breaking the spell. Rosalie fled gratefully, leaving Silas alone with the dying fire and the knowledge that 15 years hadn't changed a damn thing about how he felt. Outside, storm clouds gathered again, but for the first time in years, the approaching thunder didn't make him feel alone. Somewhere in his house, a child was learning what safety meant, and the woman he'd never stopped loving was singing her to sleep. It wasn't the life he'd imagined at 28, but at 43, he was beginning to think it might be something better, a second chance written in lightning and delivered by the storm. The abandoned cabin by the creek had stood empty for 7 years, ever since old Jonas Briggs had passed on and his kin had moved back east. Silas spent 3 days making it habitable again, patching the roof, replacing broken windows, clearing out the debris of neglect. He worked with a focused intensity that reminded him of his early days on the ranch, when building something with his own hands was the only way to quiet his restless mind. Rosalie insisted on helping, scrubbing floors while Clara gathered wildflowers to make it pretty. The child had blossomed in just a week at the ranch, her thin face filling out, her wary eyes beginning to sparkle with the curiosity natural to her age. "You don't have to do this," Rosalie said for the 100th time as Silas hauled in a bed frame he'd stored in the barn. "The room at your house is more than enough. A woman needs her own space," he replied, not meeting her eyes. The truth was more complex. Having her under his roof was proving harder than he'd anticipated. The sound of her moving about in the morning, the sight of her hair loose around her shoulders before she pinned it up, the way she unconsciously hummed while cooking, it all wore at his resolve to keep things proper between them. By the 4th day, the cabin was transformed. Simple but clean, with a main room for living, a small bedroom, and a loft where Clara could sleep. Silas had even repaired the old cook stove and laid in a supply of firewood. "It's perfect," Clara breathed, spinning in circles in the main room. Our very own house. That evening, as they moved the few possessions Rosalie had acquired into the cabin, she caught his arm. "This is too much. Silas, I can't repay—" "I'm not asking you to." He gently freed himself from her grip, the touch of her fingers leaving trails of fire on his skin. "Just do what you've been doing. Help with the ranch work. That's payment enough." But that night, the fever started. Silas had gone to check on them before bed, a habit he'd developed without acknowledging it. He found Clara crying on the porch, too frightened to wake her mother but knowing something was wrong. "She's hot," the child whispered, "and she keeps saying things that don't make sense." Inside, Rosalie lay twisted in the sheets, her skin burning and slick with sweat. She muttered incoherently, occasionally crying out names, Theodore's with fear, Silas's with longing, and others he didn't recognize. "Get my horse ready," he told Clara, forcing his voice to remain calm. "You're going to ride to the main house and wait there." "I want to stay with Mama." "Your mama needs medicine, and I need to carry her. Can you be brave for her?" The child nodded, tears streaming down her face, but jaw set with determination that reminded him painfully of her mother. The ride back to his house through the darkness felt endless. Rosalie a dead weight in his arms despite how thin she'd grown. She alternated between burning up and shaking with chills, mumbling fragments of memory and fear. "Don't let him find me," she pleaded, not seeming to know who held her. "Please, I can't go back. He'll kill me this time." "Shh," Silas murmured, urging his horse faster. "You're safe. I've got you." He sent Clara to bed despite her protests, then set about caring for Rosalie. Cool cloths for the fever, blankets for the chills, spoonfuls of water whenever she could manage them. He'd nursed sick cattle and horses plenty, but this was different. This was Rosalie, and every labored breath she took felt like it was being torn from his own chest. Through the night he kept vigil, bathing her face and arms, changing sweat-soaked sheets, holding her when the tremors became too violent. In her delirium, she lived through memories, some sweet, some terrible. "The lilacs are blooming," she said clearly at one point, eyes open but unseeing. "You said you'd wait by the lilacs." "I did wait," he told her, smoothing damp hair from her forehead. "Every damn day until they told me you'd married." She turned toward his voice, fingers clutching weakly at his shirt. "Silas? I'm here. Don't let me go. Never again." Dawn came slowly, painting the room in soft grays and pinks. The fever broke just as the first birds began to sing. Rosalie's breathing evening out into true sleep rather than fevered unconsciousness. Silas slumped in his chair, exhausted but unwilling to leave her side. He must have dozed, because he woke to find her watching him, truly aware for the first time in hours. "You stayed," she whispered. "Where else would I be?" She tried to sit up, winced, and he was there immediately, helping her lean against the pillows. "Clara is asleep in the other room. She was very brave." "How long?" "Just one night. The fever's broken." She took inventory of herself. The clean nightshirt, his sister's again, the fresh sheets, the basin of water nearby. "You took care of me. Someone had to—" "Silas." Her voice caught. "When I was delirious, did I say—" "Nothing that matters now." But they both knew that was a lie. In her fever, she'd spoken truths that daylight made difficult. She'd called for him, reached for him, whispered words of love and regret that hung in the air between them now. "I should check on Clara," she said, but when she tried to stand, her legs buckled. He caught her easily, and suddenly they were close, closer than they'd been since that last night by the cottonwoods. Her hands braced against his chest, his arms around her waist, and time seemed to stop. "Rosalie," he breathed, and she lifted her face to his. The kiss was inevitable as sunrise, soft at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid the other might disappear. Then she made a small sound in her throat, and 15 years of longing crashed over them like a wave. He pulled her closer, and she melted against him, fingers twisting in his shirt as if to anchor herself to something real. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, tears were streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry for leaving, for not fighting harder, for—" "Stop!" He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away her tears. "We can't change what's done, but we're here now." "I'm still married," she said miserably. "In the eyes of the law, the church." "To a man who beats you and threatens your child?" His voice hardened. "That's no marriage. That's imprisonment." She leaned her forehead against his chest, and he held her, feeling the tremors that had nothing to do with fever. "What are we going to do?" "First, you're going to get well. Then we're going to keep you safe. The rest," he pressed a kiss to the top of her head, "the rest we'll figure out together." Clara's voice from the doorway made them spring apart. "Mama, you're awake." The child flew across the room, and Rosalie caught her with a strength that belied her recent illness. "I'm here, baby. I'm all right." Over Clara's head, Rosalie's eyes met Silas's. There was fear there still, and uncertainty, but underneath it something else. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of belief that maybe, this time, things could be different. As he made breakfast for all of them, listening to Clara chatter about the dreams she'd had and Rosalie's quiet responses, Silas felt something settle in his chest. His house no longer felt empty. The ghosts of old dreams had been replaced by the possibility of new ones. But even as Clara laughed at something her mother said, even as Rosalie smiled that smile he'd thought lost forever, Silas couldn't shake the knowledge that this peace was temporary. Theodore Brennan was out there, searching, and men like that didn't give up what they considered theirs without a fight. The question was, would Rosalie trust him enough to stay and face whatever came? Or would fear drive her to run again, taking with her not just his second chance at love, but the family he'd never known he was missing? He brought her tea, their fingers brushing as she took the cup, and in that simple touch was a promise. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. The whispers started in town 3 weeks after Rosalie's recovery. Silas first heard them at the general store when Martha Henderson suddenly stopped talking to her companion as he entered. The two women exchanged meaningful looks before Martha offered him a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Morning, Mr. Boone. Stocking up for winter?" "Yes, ma'am." He placed his order, aware of the weighted silence behind him. As he loaded supplies into his wagon, he caught fragments of resumed conversation. "Living in sin, that poor child? What kind of example?" His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Let them talk. They didn't know Rosalie, didn't know what she'd survived, but the whispers grew louder. By the following Sunday, Reverend Michaels himself appeared at the ranch, his black coat dusty from the ride and his face set in lines of pastoral concern. "Silas," he greeted, dismounting from his buggy. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all. Reverend." Silas kept his tone neutral, though he knew well enough what had brought the man here. Coffee? They sat on the porch, the Reverend's eyes inevitably drifting toward the cabin by the creek where smoke rose from the chimney. Clara's laughter carried on the wind as she played with the barn cats. I'll speak plainly, Reverend Michaels said. There's talk in town about the woman and child staying here. I expect there is. People are concerned. A married woman, separated from her husband, living on the property of an unmarried man. You must see how it looks. I see a woman and child who needed shelter, and I provided it. Last I checked, Christian charity was still a virtue. The Reverend shifted uncomfortably. Of course, but perhaps it would be more appropriate if they stayed in town. The church could what? Silas set down his cup with deliberate care. Turn them out when her husband comes looking. Because he will. Reverend. And when he does, do you think your congregation will stand between him and them? The law says a man owns his wife like property. Is that the law you'd have me respect? Reverend Michaels sighed. I'm trying to help. Silas, the longer this continues, the harder it will be for all involved. Think of the child. What kind of future can she have with such irregularity surrounding her? As if summoned by his words, Clara appeared around the corner of the house, chasing an orange tabby. She skidded to a halt when she saw the visitor, immediately moving closer to Silas. It's all right, Silas told her. Reverend Michaels was just leaving. The Reverend stood, settling his hat on his head. I hope you'll think about what I've said, and perhaps encourage Mrs. Brennan to consider her options. After he left, Clara climbed onto the porch rail beside Silas. He doesn't like us being here, does he? What makes you say that? The way he looked at our cabin, like it was something bad. She swung her legs, thoughtful. Mama cried last night. I heard her. She thinks we're causing you trouble. Silas's chest tightened. You could never be trouble, little one, either of you. But we are, aren't we? That's why Mama wants to leave. The words hit him like cold water. She said that, Clara shrugged, suddenly interested in the barn cat twining around her ankles. She was packing our things, just looking at them. Really, but I know what it means. We've done it before. That evening, Silas found Rosalie in the garden, viciously pulling weeds as if they'd personally offended her. She didn't look up when he approached. Clara says you're thinking of leaving. Her hand stilled. Children imagine things. Do they? She sat back on her heels, finally meeting his eyes. The Reverend came to see you. He did. And before him, Mrs. Henderson happened by to borrow some eggs. Funny how she's never needed eggs before. Rosalie's laugh was bitter. I know what they're saying. Silas, I know what they think. Since when do you care what people think? Since my caring affects you. She stood abruptly, dirt-stained hands clenched at her sides. Don't you see? Your reputation? My reputation? He stepped closer, anger flaring. I've been alone on this ranch for 15 years. Rosalie, no wife, no family, just me and the cattle and too much empty space. You think I give a damn what Martha Henderson whispers over her tea? You should. This is your home, your community. No. He caught her shoulders, forcing her to face him. You're doing it again. Running because things get difficult. Because people talk. She wrenched away from him. That's not fair. Isn't it? First sign of trouble in your packing, just like before. Before? Her voice rose. You think I wanted to leave before? You think I chose? She broke off, pressing a hand to her mouth. Then tell me, he said quietly. Tell me what happened. All of it. For a long moment, she stood frozen. Then, as if a dam had broken, the words poured out. How her father had discovered their meetings. The threats, not to her, but to him. How her father had sworn he'd see Silas ruined, his fledgling ranch destroyed, if she didn't comply. The locked room, the guarded journey to Colorado, the wedding she'd attended like a funeral. I thought if I sacrificed myself, you'd be safe, she whispered. Free to find someone else, someone whose love wouldn't cost you everything. Silas felt something break inside his chest. All these years, he'd thought she'd chosen respectability over love. Instead, she'd chosen his well-being over her own happiness. Rosalie, her name came out rough, broken. So yes, I'm thinking of leaving, because I won't be the reason you lose everything. Not again. And what about what I want? She looked at him then, really looked at him, and what she saw made her breath catch. He moved toward her slowly, giving her time to retreat. When she didn't, he framed her face with his hands, calluses gentle against her skin. 15 years ago, you made a choice for both of us. Don't do that again. Silas, I've lived with respectability. He continued. I've been the model rancher, the good neighbor, the man who causes no trouble and asks for nothing, and I've been empty. Rosalie, empty in ways I didn't even understand until you walked back into my life. Tears tracked down her cheeks, and he brushed them away with his thumbs. Stay, he said simply. Whatever comes, we'll face it. Together this time. The town can go to hell. The vehemence in his voice surprised them both. I mean it. Anyone who'd turn away a woman and child in need isn't worth worrying about. And when Theodore comes, then he'll learn what kind of man I've become. I'm not that green boy your father could threaten anymore. Rosalie, this is my land, my home, and if I choose to share it with you, that's my business. She searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation. Finding none, she swayed toward him. This time when they kissed, it was different, not desperate like in his bedroom, but deep and sure and full of promise. When they broke apart, Clara was watching from the cabin porch, her small face bright with hope. Are we staying, Mama? Rosalie looked at Silas, then back at her daughter. Yes, baby, we're staying. Clara whooped and ran toward them, throwing herself at Silas's legs. He lifted her easily, and she wrapped her arms around his neck. Does this mean you'll teach me to ride? Really ride? Not just sit on Buttercup while she walks? I suppose it does. He agreed, his eyes meeting Rosalie's over the child's head. That night, after Clara was asleep, Rosalie came to the main house. They sat by the fire, not touching but aware of every breath, every movement. I'm scared, she admitted. Not of Theodore, not anymore, but of hoping, of believing this could last. Then let me hope for both of us, Silas said, until you're ready. She smiled then, soft and real. You always were stubborn, and you always were worth being stubborn for. As the fire burned low, they talked about the intervening years, about Clara, about the future they might build if they were brave enough. And when Rosalie finally returned to her cabin, Silas stood on his porch watching until her lamp went out. Standing guard against the darkness and whatever it might bring, the town could whisper, Theodore could search. But here, on this land, they would make their stand, together. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday afternoon when Silas was in the north pasture mending fence. Clara saw him first from her perch in the apple tree, a lone rider approaching on a dust-covered bay horse. Something about the way he sat his saddle, rigid, purposeful, made her shimmy down and run for the cabin. Mama, she called, breathless. Someone's coming. Rosalie emerged from the garden, shading her eyes against the sun. The moment she saw the rider, her face went pale. Without a word, she ushered Clara inside and latched the door. The stranger dismounted at the main house, tying his horse to the porch rail with practiced efficiency. He was a lean man, weathered by sun and wind, with the kind of careful movements that suggested violence held in check. When he knocked, it was with the confidence of someone who expected to be answered. "Help you?" Rosalie asked through the barely open door, pitching her voice lower, rougher than normal. "Looking for someone," the man said, his eyes trying to peer past her into the house. "Woman about your height, dark hair, traveling with a young girl. Might have come through here in the last month or so. Haven't seen anyone like that." Rosalie kept her face partially hidden. "This is a working ranch. We don't get many visitors." The stranger's eyes narrowed. Mind if I look around? Check your outbuildings. Ranch owner's not here. You'd need to speak with Mr. Boone. And where might I find him? North pasture, but he doesn't take kindly to strangers poking around his property. The man touched his hat brim mockingly. I'll be sure to mind my manners. After he rode off, Rosalie sank against the door frame, legs shaking. Clara crept out from the bedroom where she'd been hiding. Was that one of Papa's men? I think so, baby. Rosalie pulled her close. We need to be very careful now. In the north pasture, Silas looked up from his work to see the rider approaching. He straightened slowly, hammer still in hand, and waited. Mr. Boone? The stranger didn't dismount, a discourtesy that set Silas's teeth on edge. Name's Pike. I'm looking for a woman, Mrs. Theodore Brennan. Been told she might have passed this way. Lots of people pass through Wyoming territory, Silas said evenly. What's your interest in this woman? Her husband hired me to find her. She took something that belongs to him. That's so? His daughter. Man has a right to his child. Silas set down his hammer deliberately. In my experience, Mr. Pike, children aren't possessions to be owned. They're people to be cared for. Pike's hand drifted toward his sidearm. That's a peculiar philosophy. Makes me wonder if you've seen more than you're saying. I see a man on my land asking questions he's got no right to ask. Silas's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that came from absolute certainty. I'll ask you to move along now. Public road runs through here. I've got every right. Roads that way. Silas pointed west. This is private property, and I don't recall inviting you onto it. They stared at each other for a long moment. Two predators taking measure. Finally, Pike touched his hat again. That same mocking gesture. I'll be staying in town a few days. If you happen to remember anything about Mrs. Brennan, I'm sure her husband would be grateful. Might even be a reward in it. I'll keep that in mind. After Pike rode off, Silas finished his fence repairs with mechanical precision, his mind racing. By the time he returned to the house, Rosalie was pacing the kitchen like a caged animal. We have to go, she said the moment he entered. Tonight. I won't let them take Clara. Nobody's taking anybody. He caught her hands, stilling her frantic movements. Tell me exactly what happened. As she recounted Pike's visit, Silas felt a cold rage building in his chest. The man had been testing, probing for weakness, and he'd be back. He doesn't know for certain you're here, Silas said when she finished. If he did, he wouldn't have left. But he suspects, and he'll wire Theodore, and then we'll be ready. That night, after Clara was asleep, they sat together on Silas's porch, the loaded rifle across his knees. Rosalie had tried to protest staying at the main house, but he'd overruled her. If trouble came, he wanted them close. I can't ask you to fight my battles, she said quietly. You're not asking, I'm choosing. She studied his profile in the moonlight. When did you become this man? This certain, steady person who faces down hired guns without flinching? The day you left, he said simply. I had two choices. Let the loss destroy me or build something strong enough that no one could take what was mine again. I'm not yours. Silas. But the words lacked conviction. He turned to her then, and what she saw in his eyes made her breath catch. Aren't you? The kiss was different this time. Urgent, desperate. 15 years of longing compressed into the space between heartbeats. When he pulled her onto his lap, she didn't protest, her hands tangling in his hair as if she could anchor him to her through will alone. Rosalie, he breathed against her throat. Let me, yes, she whispered, and that single word shattered the last of his restraint. He carried her inside, to the bedroom that had been empty too long. In the darkness, they found each other with hands that trembled, with whispered endearments and promises. Every touch was a revelation, every kiss a vow. When he traced the scars Theodore had left, she wept, not from pain, but from the tenderness with which he honored each mark of her survival. You're so beautiful, he murmured, and she believed him. seeing herself reflected in his eyes not as damaged goods, but as something precious, worthy of devotion. They moved together with the desperate passion of lovers who knew how fragile happiness could be, who had learned through bitter experience that tomorrow was never guaranteed. But there was healing in it too, a reclaiming of what had been stolen from them both. Afterward, they lay entwined, her head on his chest, his fingers combing through her unbound hair. "I love you," she said, the words rusty from disuse. "I never stopped. Through everything, you were the voice in my head telling me to be strong, to survive, even when I thought I'd never see you again." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "You're here now. That's all that matters. What if—" "No." He tilted her chin up. "No more what-ifs. No more running. Tomorrow, Pike will wire Theodore. Fine, let him come. This time, you're not facing him alone." She traced patterns on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. "I feel safe," she whispered. "For the first time in so many years, I feel safe." They dozed fitfully, starting at every sound. When dawn broke, they dressed quietly, the intimacy of the night crystallizing into shared purpose. Whatever came next, they would face it together. At breakfast, Clara looked between them with knowing eyes. "Are we a family now?" she asked with a child's directness. Rosalie flushed, but Silas answered calmly. "We're whatever you need us to be, little one." "I need us to be together," Clara said simply. "All of us." Pike would return. Theodore would come. The town would whisper and judge. But in this moment, in this kitchen filled with morning light and the simple domesticity of shared breakfast, they had everything that mattered. They had each other, and Silas would die before he let anyone take that away again. Theodore Brennan arrived with the dust of the afternoon sun, flanked by Pike and another hired gun, a thick-set man with dead eyes who kept his hand near his pistol. They approached the ranch like they owned it, their horses' hooves raising small clouds that hung golden in the still air. Silas stood waiting on his porch, rifle leaning against the rail within easy reach but not in hand, a careful balance of readiness and restraint. He'd sent Rosalie and Clara to the root cellar behind the house with strict instructions to stay hidden no matter what they heard. "Boone!" Theodore dismounted with the confidence of a man used to getting his way. He was younger than Silas had expected, perhaps 35, with a kind of harsh good looks that masked cruelty. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." "Can't say that I do," Silas replied evenly. "This is private property. Brennan, state your business or move along." Theodore's laugh was cold. "My business is my wife and daughter. Pike here says you were less than helpful when he came calling. Makes a man wonder what you're hiding." "Only thing I'm hiding is my impatience with strangers who don't know how to mind their manners." The thick-set man shifted, leather creaking. "Want me to search the place, boss?" "Not just yet. Hank." Theodore stepped closer to the porch. "See, Mr. Boone, I'm a reasonable man. I understand my wife might have told you stories. Lord knows she's got an imagination on her, but the law is clear. She's my wife. The girl is my daughter. And I have every right to collect what's mine, even if that were true," Silas said slowly. "And I'm not saying it is. What kind of man has to hire guns to retrieve his family? Seems to me a loving wife and child would come willing." Theodore's face darkened. "What passes between a man and his wife is private business. The law says a lot of things. Doesn't make them right. I'm done talking." Theodore nodded to his men. "Search the property. Every building, every corner. No." The single word hung in the air like a challenge. Silas hadn't moved, but something in his stance shifted, subtle as a snake coiling to strike. "No," Theodore repeated, incredulous. "You want to search my land. You come back with the sheriff and a warrant. Otherwise, you're trespassing." Pike spoke up, his voice oily with false reason. "Now, Mr. Boone, no need for unpleasantness. We just want to confirm the woman ain't here. Then we'll be on our way." "You'll be on your way now." Silas's hand moved slightly, not toward the rifle but to rest on his hip, near the Colt holstered there. "This is your last warning." The tension stretched taut as wire. Hank's fingers twitched toward his gun. But Theodore held up a hand. "You're making a mistake. Boone, I've got the law on my side. Then use it. But right now, you're 3 armed men on my property without permission. In Wyoming territory, that's enough cause for a man to defend what's his." For a long moment, nobody moved. Then, from the barn, came the sound of horses, multiple horses, approaching fast. All heads turned as 3 riders appeared, Sheriff Watson and 2 deputies, badges glinting in the sun. "Gentlemen," the sheriff called out, dismounting smoothly. "Got a wire saying there might be trouble brewing out here. Thought I'd come see for myself." Theodore's jaw clenched. "Sheriff, good. This man is harboring my wife. That's a serious accusation." Watson interrupted. He was an older man, gray-bearded and steady-eyed. "You got proof?" "She's here. I know it. Knowing and proving are different things." The sheriff looked at Silas. "Mr. Boone, you got anything to say?" "Just that these men are trespassing and refusing to leave." Watson nodded slowly. "I see. Mr. Brennan, might I suggest we handle this proper-like? If you believe your wife is here, we can look into it. But vigilante justice ain't how we do things in my jurisdiction." Pike started to protest, but Theodore silenced him with a look. "Fine. We'll do it your way, Sheriff. But I want—" He never finished the sentence. From the house came a piercing scream, Clara's voice, high with terror. Without thinking, Silas vaulted the porch rail and ran. The other men close behind. They found her at the root cellar, sobbing hysterically. The heavy door stood open, and inside, Rosalie lay crumpled on the earthen floor, her face gray and still. "Mama won't wake up," Clara wailed. "She just fell down and won't wake up." Silas dropped beside Rosalie, checking for a pulse. It was there, but thready. "Get the doctor," he barked at one of the deputies. "Ride hard." As he lifted Rosalie carefully, Theodore stepped forward. "My wife." Silas's eyes were deadly when they met his. "Touch her, and I'll kill you where you stand." "You heard him?" Sheriff Watson said quietly. "Back off, Brennan." They carried Rosalie into the house, Clara clinging to Silas's leg. The child was shaking with sobs, and it was the sheriff who gently drew her aside, speaking in low, soothing tones while Silas tended to her mother. "Just fear and exhaustion," the doctor pronounced when he arrived an hour later. "She'll come around, but she needs rest and peace. No upsets." Theodore had been forced to wait outside, Pike and Hank flanking him like guard dogs. Now he pushed forward. "When she wakes, I'm taking her home." "No," Clara said suddenly, her small voice cutting through the tension. "No, you're not." Everyone turned to look at the child. She stood straight despite her tear-stained face, chin lifted in an echo of her mother's determination. "Clara." Theodore's voice turned syrupy sweet. "Papa's here to take you home." "You're not my papa." The words came out clear and strong. "You hurt Mama. You hit her and made her cry. Papas don't do that." "You don't understand." "I understand plenty." Clara moved closer to Silas, her hand finding his. "I understand that Mama smiles here. She sings again. She doesn't jump at every sound or hide bruises under her sleeves." The sheriff's expression had grown increasingly grim. "That true, Mr. Brennan? You've been hitting your wife. Discipline between married folks is still assault in my book." Watson's hand rested on his gun. "Especially when there's a child involved." From the bedroom came a weak voice. "Clara." The little girl flew to her mother's side, and Silas followed. Rosalie was conscious but pale, her eyes finding his immediately. "I heard shouting," she whispered. "It's handled. The sheriff's here." She struggled to sit up, and he helped her, propping pillows behind her back. Through the open door, they could see Theodore arguing with the sheriff, his voice rising in frustration. "I won't go back," Rosalie said quietly. "I'll die first." "You won't have to." Silas took her hand. "I promise." Sheriff Watson appeared in the doorway. "Ma'am, I need to ask you some questions, official-like, about your marriage and why you left." Rosalie's fingers tightened on Silas's, but she nodded. "Yeah, I'll tell you everything." For the next hour, she spoke, haltingly at first, then with growing strength. She told of the violence, the threats, the fear that had driven her to flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Clara added her own observations with a child's devastating honesty. The sheriff took notes, his expression growing stonier with each revelation. When they finished, Watson stood. "Mr. Brennan, I'm placing you under arrest for assault and making threats of violence." "You can't. She's my wife. The law protects people from harm, regardless of who's doing the harming." The sheriff nodded to his deputies. "Take him in." Theodore erupted then, cursing and threatening, but Pike and Hank apparently knew better than to interfere with legal authority. They watched stone-faced as their employer was led away in irons. "We'll be at the hotel in town," Pike told Silas quietly as they prepared to leave. "This isn't over. It is for me," Silas replied. "And if you're smart, it is for you too." After they'd gone, a strange quiet settled over the house. Clara had crawled into bed beside her mother, and both had fallen into exhausted sleep. Silas sat vigil in a chair by the door, rifle across his knees, watching the sun set over his land. Sheriff Watson returned as the first stars appeared. "Thought you should know. Brennan's wired for a lawyer. This is going to court." "Let it." The sheriff studied him. "You prepared for that? It could get ugly. His word against hers. And the law still favors husbands in these matters. Then we'll change the law." Watson's smile was grim but approving, spoken like a man who's found something worth fighting for. He paused at the door. "For what it's worth. Boone, I believe her. Seen too many women with those kinds of bruises to doubt. We'll do what we can." After the sheriff left, Silas maintained his watch. Somewhere in town, Theodore Brennan sat in a cell, no doubt plotting his next move. But here, in this house, two people who'd suffered too much slept peacefully, protected and safe. He'd failed to protect Rosalie once before. He would not fail again. The courthouse in town was packed to capacity on the morning of the hearing. Word had spread through the territory like wildfire. A wife fleeing her husband, a prominent rancher harboring her, violence and threats and questions of law versus justice. Everyone, it seemed, had come to witness the spectacle. Rosalie sat very straight beside the lawyer Sheriff Watson had recommended, a young man named James Hartwell, who had the earnest face of someone determined to prove himself. She wore her best dress, actually Mary's dress, and had pinned her hair severely back, but nothing could hide the bruise on her wrist where Theodore had grabbed her years ago and twisted until something cracked. She'd never had it properly set. Theodore sat across the aisle with his Denver lawyer, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who radiated confidence. Theodore himself appeared the picture of wounded respectability, his face arranged in lines of sorrow rather than anger. "All rise," the bailiff called. "The Honorable Judge William Garrison presiding." Judge Garrison was an older man with penetrating eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He settled himself and looked over the courtroom with obvious displeasure at the packed galleries. "This is a preliminary hearing," he announced. "Not a circus. I'll have order or I'll clear the room." He shuffled papers. "We're here to address the matter of custody regarding one Clara Brennan and allegations of assault made against Mr. Theodore Brennan. Mr. Fitzgerald. You may begin." Theodore's lawyer stood smoothly. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter. My client's wife abandoned her marital home without cause, taking their daughter. She has been living in a scandalous arrangement with Mr. Silas Boone, bringing shame upon her husband's good name. We ask that you order her immediate return to her rightful home and husband." "Without cause?" Hartwell jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, we have evidence." "You'll have your turn. Mr. Hartwell." The judge said, "Continue. Mr. Fitzgerald." "Furthermore," the lawyer continued, These allegations of assault are merely the desperate inventions of a woman trying to justify her adultery. Mr. Brennan is a respected businessman in Colorado, a man of impeccable character who wants only to reunite his family. When Hartwell finally got his chance, he called Rosalie to testify. She walked to the witness chair with careful dignity, aware of every eye upon her. "Mrs. Brennan," Hartwell began gently, "can you tell the court why you left your husband?" Rosalie's voice started soft but grew stronger. "Because I feared for my life, and for my daughter's life." "Can you be specific?" She described the violence in clinical detail. The first slap on their wedding night when she'd cried from homesickness, the escalating brutality, the careful placement of bruises where they wouldn't show. Several women in the gallery shifted uncomfortably, recognition in their eyes. "And the final incident?" Hartwell prompted. "Clara tried to stop him from hitting me. She's only 7, but she threw herself between us." He backhanded her across the room. Rosalie's voice cracked. "That's when I knew we had to run." Fitzgerald cross-examined ruthlessly. "Isn't it true, Mrs. Brennan, that you've been living on Mr. Boone's property?" "Yes. In close proximity, unchaperoned, in a separate cabin, with my daughter." "But you take meals together? Spend evenings together?" "Mr. Boone has been kind." "I'm sure he has." Fitzgerald's tone was insinuating. "Tell me, did you know Mr. Boone before your marriage?" Rosalie's chin lifted. "Yes. In fact, you were romantically involved. 15 years ago, yes. And now, conveniently, you've found your way back to him. Rather suspicious timing, wouldn't you say?" Before Rosalie could answer, a commotion arose from the gallery. A woman stood up, Mrs. Patricia Morrison, the banker's wife, pillar of the community. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I have something to say." The judge frowned. "This is highly irregular. Please." "Mrs." Morrison's voice carried surprising authority. "I've been silent too long." After a moment's hesitation, the judge nodded. "Mrs." Morrison made her way forward. "I've known Theodore Brennan for 3 years," she said. "He banks with my husband. Last year, I saw Mrs. Brennan at a social function in Denver. She wore a high-necked dress in July heat. When she reached for her tea, her sleeve pulled back. The bruises were unmistakable." A murmur ran through the crowd. Theodore's lawyer objected loudly. "But Mrs." Morrison continued. "I said nothing then, to my shame. We don't speak of such things, but I won't be silent while a woman is condemned for protecting herself and her child." As Mrs. Morrison returned to her seat, another woman stood, then another. One by one, they came forward, women who'd seen bruises, who'd heard Clara crying, who'd watched Rosalie fade from a vibrant young woman to a ghost walking in fear. "This is hearsay," Fitzgerald protested. "This is testimony to character," Judge Garrison corrected. "I'll allow it." When Clara was called, Silas had to physically restrain himself from intervening. The child looked so small in the witness chair, but her voice was steady. "He hit Mama all the time," she said simply. "Sometimes with his hands, sometimes with his belt. He said it was to make her better, but it only made her sad." "Clara," Fitzgerald said with false gentleness, "sometimes children misunderstand adult situations. I know what hitting looks like." Clara interrupted. "And I know what love looks like, Mr. Silas shows Mama love. He's gentle and kind and makes her laugh. That's what a real papa does." Theodore finally took the stand in his own defense, painting himself as a concerned husband dealing with a hysterical wife. But under Hartwell's questioning, his mask slipped. "You deny ever striking your wife?" "I may have had to correct her occasionally." "Correct her?" "She was willful, disobedient. A man has the right to maintain order in his home, even if that order comes through violence." Theodore's face flushed. "It wasn't violence. It was discipline. If she'd just listened, if she just submitted to being beaten." "I never beat her," Theodore exploded. A few slaps to calm her hysterics. Nothing more. It's what any man would do with a difficult wife. The admission hung in the air like smoke. Even his own lawyer looked dismayed. Judge Garrison called a recess. When they reconvened, his expression was grave. "The law in these matters is complex," he began. "Traditionally, a husband has had certain rights over his household. However, the law also recognizes that those rights have limits." He looked directly at Theodore. "Mr. Brennan, by your own admission, you struck your wife and child. Whatever you choose to call it, discipline, correction, it was violence. Moreover, the testimony presented suggests a pattern of such behavior that any reasonable person would find abhorrent." "Your Honor," Fitzgerald began. "I'm not finished." The judge's voice was stern. "As for the allegations regarding Mrs. Brennan's living situation, I find them irrelevant to the matter at hand. A woman fleeing violence has the right to seek shelter where she can find it." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "It is the judgment of this court that the minor child, Clara, shall remain in the custody of her mother. Furthermore, Mr. Brennan is hereby ordered to have no contact with either his wife or daughter. Any violation of this order will result in immediate imprisonment." "You can't do this!" Theodore shot to his feet. "She's my wife. The child is mine by law." "The law is what I say it is in this courtroom," Judge Garrison replied coldly. "And I say a man who beats women and children has forfeited his rights to them. Bailiff, escort Mr. Brennan out." As Theodore was removed, still shouting threats and protests, Rosalie swayed in her chair. Silas was there immediately, steadying her. "It's over," he murmured. "You're free." But Rosalie was looking at the gallery, at the women who'd stood for her, many of whom she'd never met. Mrs. Morrison caught her eye and nodded once, a gesture of solidarity that said more than words could express. Outside the courthouse, as Theodore was loaded into a wagon to be escorted to the territorial border, he caught sight of them. His eyes met Rosalie's, and the hatred there was palpable. "This isn't over," he called. "You're still my wife in the eyes of God." "Then God and I will have to disagree," Rosalie replied quietly, and turned away. As they walked back to the ranch, Silas, Rosalie, and Clara hand in hand, the town watched, some with approval, some with lingering disapproval, but all with the knowledge that something had shifted. A precedent had been set. A woman had stood against her abuser and won. "What happens now?" Clara asked, swinging between them. "Now," Silas said, looking at Rosalie over the child's head. "We go home. All of us together? All of us together." And for the first time in years, Rosalie truly smiled. Not the careful, guarded expression she'd worn like armor, but the radiant joy he remembered from their youth. They were free. All of them. Finally free. 1 year later, spring came early to Wyoming territory, painting the valleys green and dotting the hillsides with wildflowers. The ranch had transformed, not just in appearance, but in spirit, where once silence had reigned. Now laughter echoed from the main house and the small bakery Rosalie had established in the corner room. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and bright. Clara, now 8 and blooming with health, scattered rose petals along the path from the house to the meadow where they'd chosen to hold the ceremony. She wore a new dress, store-bought from Denver, with real lace, and carried herself with the confidence of a child who knew she was loved. "Mama, you look beautiful," she breathed when Rosalie emerged from the house. The dress was simple but elegant, made by Mrs. Morrison herself as a gift. The women of town had embraced Rosalie after the trial, forming a quiet network of support that had helped her establish her bakery business. Her bread and pies were now sought after throughout the county, providing her with independence she'd never dreamed possible. "Not as beautiful as you, my darling," Rosalie said, smoothing Clara's hair. Sheriff Watson waited in the meadow to officiate, having gotten himself certified for the occasion. A small gathering of friends had assembled, the Hartwell family, several neighboring ranchers, Mrs. Morrison, and some of the other women who'd stood up in court. and even gruff old Sam from the livery stable. Silas stood beneath the old cottonwood, the one where they'd carved their initials so many years ago. The lightning-struck half had been cleared away, but the remaining trunk stood strong, new growth sprouting from its base. He wore his best suit, looking uncomfortable in the formal clothes, but radiating a joy that made him seem younger than his 44 years. When their eyes met across the meadow, the years fell away. They were young again, full of dreams and promises, but tempered now with the wisdom that comes from loss and the sweetness of second chances. Clara walked beside her mother, having refused to be separated from her for even this short journey. As they approached, she looked up at Silas with solemn eyes. "You promise to take care of us?" she asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I promise," he said gravely. "Always. And we'll take care of you too," Clara added firmly. "That's what families do." A ripple of gentle laughter went through the gathering as Sheriff Watson began the ceremony. The words were simple. Wyoming territory didn't go in for elaborate ceremonies, but they carried weight. "Do you, Rosalie, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Her voice was clear and certain, her eyes never leaving Silas's face. "Do you, Silas, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." The words came out rough with emotion. "For the rest of my days." When Watson pronounced them husband and wife, Clara cheered louder than anyone, throwing her remaining rose petals in the air like confetti. Silas kissed his bride, and for a moment, they were the only two people in the world. The celebration that followed was modest but joyful. Tables had been set up under the trees, laden with food, including several of Rosalie's famous pies. Sam brought out his fiddle, and there was dancing on the grass as the sun traced its path across the sky. "Never thought I'd see the day, Mrs." Morrison confided to Rosalie during a quiet moment. "Silas Boone, married and smiling. You've worked a miracle, my dear." "He saved us," Rosalie said softly. "It seemed only fair to save him back." As evening approached, the guests began to drift away. Leaving the new family alone, they walked together to the barn, where Silas had a surprise waiting. "What do you think?" he asked, opening the door with a flourish. Inside, the barn had been transformed. The stall where Rosalie had once hidden in desperation was gone, replaced by a clean, bright space filled with shelves and a proper oven. "For your bakery," he explained. "So you don't have to work out of the kitchen anymore. This way you can expand, maybe hire some help." Rosalie's eyes filled with tears. "Silas." "A woman should have her own enterprise," he said firmly. "Something that's hers, that no one can take away." She kissed him then, pouring all her gratitude and love into the gesture. Clara, meanwhile, was already exploring the space, exclaiming over the windows that let in perfect morning light and the clever shelving system Silas had built. That night, as they sat on the porch of what was now truly their home, Clara asleep with her head in Rosalie's lap, they watched the stars emerge one by one. "Do you ever think about how different it all could have been?" Rosalie asked. "If I hadn't left, if we'd fought harder?" "No," Silas said firmly. "That path led here, led to Clara, led to you becoming the strong woman you are. I wouldn't change it. Even the pain, even that." He took her hand, running his thumb over the simple gold band he'd placed there that morning. "We earned this happiness, Rosalie, every bit of it." A year ago, she'd appeared in his barn like a ghost from the past, frightened and desperate. Now she was his wife, a successful businesswoman, a pillar of a community that had learned to look beyond convention to see truth. The transformation was remarkable, but not as remarkable as the simple fact that they were here, together, with a future stretching before them bright with promise. "Mama?" Clara stirred, blinking sleepily. "Are we home?" Rosalie looked at Silas, then at the ranch spread before them, the house that rang with laughter, the barn that had sheltered them in their darkest hour, the land that had become their sanctuary. "Yes, my darling," she said softly. "We're home," as if in agreement. A warm breeze swept across the porch, carrying with it the scent of spring flowers and new beginnings. Somewhere in the distance, a nightingale began to sing, its melody rising into the star-filled sky like a benediction. They had traveled a long road to reach this moment, through separation and sorrow, through fear and violence, through the judgment of others and the courage to stand against injustice. But here, in this place they'd built together, they had found something worth every struggle, a love that had survived time and trial, a family forged not just by blood, but by choice, and a home where the word safety meant more than locks and walls. It meant being truly, fully, finally free to love without fear. Silas stood and lifted the sleeping Clara into his arms. "Come on, little one, time for bed." As he carried her inside, Clara murmured against his shoulder, "I love you, Papa." The word he'd never thought to hear wrapped around his heart like a gift. Behind him, Rosalie rose, pausing to look once more at the barn where it all began. Then she followed her family inside, closing the door on the past and opening it to all the tomorrows yet to come. In the morning, she would bake bread, and Silas would tend the ranch, and Clara would gather eggs while singing off-key. There would be challenges, there always were, but they would face them together. For now, though, there was only this, a man, a woman, and a child, bound by love and hope and the unshakable certainty that some things, once found, are worth holding on to forever. The barn stood silent in the moonlight, no longer a refuge for the desperate, but a monument to the possible, proof that sometimes, if you're very lucky and very brave, love does get a second chance. Thank you so much for listening to this story of love, loss, and redemption in the Old West. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below. If you enjoyed Silas and Rosalie's journey, don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more tales of frontier romance and adventure. What did you think of their second chance at love? Share your thoughts below. And let's keep the campfire conversation going.